In this week's lesson, we're going to be doing the 3/4 portrait in watercolors, and I am so excited to introduce to you my guest teacher for the week, Lucy Bryden, who I met in Scotland a few years ago. All of the resources for the lesson are located at awesomeartschool.com, and the link is in the description box. Enjoy!
Hi everyone, Karen has kindly asked me to take part in your Fun Fab Faces challenge and make a video, and I'm going to do one on doing watercolour and 3/4 faces. So here are just some examples of the ones that I have in my watercolour journal. So we're going to do something kind of a bit similar to this. And I know that drawing 3/4 faces can be a little bit tricky. I don't even know if I can explain it properly, but I'll try. And I'll do a voiceover and speed up most of this video so it's not a super lengthy process. So the first thing that we're going to do is we are not going to draw straight into our watercolour journal or paper, because we don't want to ruin the surface of the paper with lots of harsh pencil lines or lots of eraser marks, which can actually damage the surface of your paper and mean that when you paint it kind of ruins the surface a little bit. What we're going to do is we are going to just draw onto a blank sheet of paper, and then once we've done that, we're going to transfer this over and put it into our watercolour paper, and I will talk you through the various different ways that you can transfer when we get to that stage. So I've been looking through Pixabay, and you can just do a search for woman portrait, something like that. These are royalty-free images, so you don't have to worry about copying them. Although, that being said, my pictures never look like the reference when I'm done, so it doesn't really matter too much if you're going to switch it up a lot, but you do have to bear in mind copyright. So really what I'm using this picture for is just it's just almost like training my head in where things go in the picture and what they look like and maybe what the shading is. But usually once I've done the drawing stage, I don't really refer to it that much. I don't really aim to get a good likeness of the picture itself. So I have downloaded this image, so it's in my iPad, and I'm going to put it in front of me while I'm drawing, and I will send the image over to Karen so that you can refer to it yourself if you want to do this exact one, but feel free to choose your own portrait, 3/4 portrait picture to refer to if you find one that you prefer. So I chose this one because I quite liked the look on her face, but whether I can actually manage to reproduce that is another thing. So there's going to be quite a lot of drawing and erasing here, and that is why it's quite a good idea to do this on a separate piece of paper and not on your watercolour paper.
So I start off here by drawing a rough circle shape. This is for the top half of her head, and you can see that I draw quite a few just to get the shape correct. And then the bottom part of her head is kind of an offset triangle, so it's leaning more towards the right. And now I'm drawing out some guidelines to let me see where her nose and her eyes are going to go. So again, you can see these are angled off towards the right rather than in the center like you would do if you were doing a front-facing portrait. And I tend to kind of erase out some of the lines as I'm going along just so that I can see clearer what I'm doing. Because the bottom of that circle wasn't quite right for where her nose was going to go. And then this is almost like carving. I chip into that circle to create that shape that you get where the eye socket goes in and the cheekbone goes out. And then if you notice her, in this picture, it's her right hand eye, it disappears into the bridge of the nose. So the right hand eye is right over to the right hand side of the face, and the left hand eye is much further left, and the right hand eye is disappearing into the bridge of the nose there. So you almost don't see that left hand corner of it. It's just disappearing off in. And the same with the nose, you only see really the left nostril. It depends how 3/4 your face is. And similarly, her lips again are off center, so that the right hand side of her lips you see less of them. And I'm just using the photo reference here to try and get the angles and everything correct for both the nose and the lips, because it depends what photo reference that you're using, how much of those that you see. In some 3/4 poses, you do see some of the right hand nostril. Depends how far the face is tilted round, but in this one we only see the left hand nostril. So I started off by drawing that circle of the nose like I would do if I was drawing a front facing portrait, but then only drew the left hand nostril, so the angle is slightly different. And you can see that I'm also refining the lines as I go as well. So I start off quite sketchy and then I go in and correct the angles and the lines as I'm going along.
What I'm doing here is I am taking my pencil and I am measuring across so that I can see that with the straight line going across, actually her right eye is much lower than her left eye. Can you see that? So that is something that you can avoid it looking funny by just measuring and seeing where the angles meet. So I also did angles for like the tip of her nose and her lip. So you could see that where her nose and her lip, it's almost like a straight line down. Those two are a straight line down from each other, and similarly the corner of her eye and her nose, those two meet up as well, and then where her pupil is meets up with the edge of this side of her lip as well. So I'm just doing a little bit of measuring and adjusting as I go along.
So once I've corrected that eye angle, which was far too low to begin with, I go in and erase all the marks that I made to get the angle of the face right and the placement of the features, just so that when I trace my picture I can see better what lines it is that I need to trace. And just do quite a lot of double checking and adjusting as you're going along, and don't really aim for a perfect likeness of the photograph that you're doing, because even getting features a couple of millimeters off can make the person that you're drawing look completely different. But really, I don't aim for that when I'm doing these kind of portraits. I'm not trying to get it to look like the actual photograph, so I don't worry too much about that. But certainly adjusting does help get the face look more like a proper face. And it just takes a bit of time and practice just to see where even just adjusting like the slight angles of the lips or so on can make a huge difference to the way that the face looks when you're doing your finished piece.
Okay, that's her drawn out. I didn't include the hood that was in the original photo because I want to do my kind of abstract patterns in the background. And we are going to transfer her over into the watercolor sketchbook. So what I do for doing this is I have a light box, so I can put this on top of my light box. I'm not going to show this on camera. I can put this on top of my light box and put this paper on top and just trace through the lines. If you do not have a light box, you can put your paper up against a really bright window, or you can also cover this with charcoal and then trace through carefully and try not to get too much charcoal on your paper. So those are the 3 ways that you can transfer your picture. So I've now transferred my drawing and it's so pale that you probably won't see it in the book. I am using my tube watercolors that are put into this palette here, but you can use whatever watercolors you have. So when I'm talking through in the voiceover, I'll just be speaking about, you know, I'm using a pale yellow ochre or whatever, and you can just use whatever colors you have. And I have a selection of brushes in different sizes and 2 jars of water, one for washing my dirty paint and one for picking up clean water, and a paper towel for dabbing off my brush if I need to. Just before I speed up the video, I'm going to quickly touch on the different paints that I would use for skin tones, so you don't have to worry about what ones you're using. So one of them here I've got is a Juan Brilliant, and this is quite good for like a base skin tone. It's quite a yellow colour, but it's, you know, it's a fairly good base skin tone. So if I'm just speaking about without mixing, that is one of them that is quite good to use. And similarly, there's a Naples Yellow. They are both fairly yellow, so if you wish, you can take them and mix them with a little bit of pink and pinky them up a little bit. To make darker tones, I would mix some kind of brown shade, and there are different ways of doing that. So if I was to take some kind of red, and this is an alizarin crimson, so here's a different kind of red, there's 2 different reds there, and then mix them with a yellow ochre, I will get a more reddishy, orangey, pinky skin tone. You can mix this with some kind of brown to darken it. And if you want to cool them off, you can actually mix them with a very small amount of blue. To make them into a cooler tone. So this is quite an in-depth thing. I don't really feel that I want to talk about this in too in-depth in this video, but this is just to give you a little indication.
So I start off by laying a very pale foundation of skin tone onto part of her face, not the whole part though. I do like to leave some parts just either the white of the paper or as pale as I can, and there are the highlights. So at this point really you're thinking about just shades and tones and lights and darks rather than any specific features. And I've done a fairly wet wash at this point, and even though you won't see in this sped up video my brush either mixing all the colours or going in and out and seeing me getting new water or rinsing my brush out, because those bits would have just taken up far too long in this video. You will see that I do that on a regular basis. So I would lay a colour down and then maybe rinse my brush out and then use just the clean brush to blend the colour. Sometimes I use 2 brushes, because if I've loaded my brush up with colour and I've painted just a small part, and then I want to blend that out, because if you wait too long you won't get that super blending, I will take another wet brush to blend it so that I'm not washing out the paint that I've got loaded up onto my brush, and I can use it for another application. With her hair, I'm just doing the same. I'm doing a fairly wet wash with a large brush for the first layer of her hair, and I'm not really trying to get proper hair hair effect in this painting. It's going to be a little bit abstract. So one thing to remember when you're doing watercolor is that if your paper is wet, the paint will bleed into wherever the wet paper is. So what I tend to do with my paintings is I will move around the paper on a regular basis. So I will move to do a part of the painting that doesn't have any wet paint on it, which is why I did the first layer of her face and then went on to do the hair. So while that was happening, the first layer of her face was drying, so I could then go on and do the next layer of glazing on top, and it wouldn't bleed in to what I'd done before. And this is especially important when it comes to doing the eyes and the lips. If your paper is wet, when you go to paint those, the colors from the eyes or the lips will bleed into the color that you've put down for her skin. So it's quite important, unless you want that look, because that lovely bleedy look could be what you're looking for in watercolor. It's quite important to let those separate areas dry, which is why I move around doing one part of the picture, let that dry while I do another part, and then go back and do a second layer on top, which again creates depth. So I'm using some of the various skin tones that I mixed up previously in the video to show you. So they're just a combination of some different reds, either the Naples yellow or the Juan Brilliant or a yellow ochre, and then sometimes I add a touch of darker brown, which in my case is it's called Caput Morticum, I think, and it's by Winsor & Newton, or even some of the transparent sienna, which is what I've used for her hair. And then sometimes to cool those down, I'll use a touch of blue or green, just a very, very tiny touch, and that cools down those tones, because you don't want it looking too pinky, although that might be the look that you're going for. You know, these portraits do not have to use skin tones. If you want, you could do your watercolor portrait just with different tones of purple or blue, and it's quite nice to do a monochromatic painting that way using watercolors. So that is another option, and it's quite a good exercise as well, because it helps to teach you how to mix up varying degrees of darkness with your watercolors. So using lots of water and a very small amount of paint will give you a very, very light tone, and then using larger amounts of paint and smaller amount of water will give you a darker tone. So you could do this exercise in that way if you so wish. So you can see that as I'm moving around the face, I'm getting darker and darker and layering up those colours. Another thing to take note of is size of brushes. So depending on what area I'm painting, I will switch around and use different brushes, so that if I've got a larger area to paint, I will use a larger brush. And if I've got a smaller area to paint, so specifically around the eyes and the lips, I will use a smaller brush so that I can get into that detail and not make it messy. So at this point, it is mostly wet on dry technique, and I am doing it here where I'm kind of trying to blend colours out and make them quite a smooth transition. But as I said, you don't have to do that with watercolors. It can also look nice if you can actually see where the colors are glazed on top of each other. I'm using, for my dark tones, this is not a black. It is actually called Neutral Tint, and it's by Winsor & Newton, and it's a lovely kind of bluishy grey, a very dark tone, and it's really nice for adding to certain colours to dull them and darken them up. And I quite like adding this with a bit of Prussian blue, and it makes like a very dark blue, almost black, without it being, I guess it's a bit more like a Payne's grey rather than a black. And I quite like adding a kind of a pinky tone to the nose, so that's what I'm doing here as well. And you can see that when I've mixed one colour up like that, I will sometimes tend to move around the paper and deepen all the tones using that colour or something very similar, and that helps to create a bit of unity within your piece. Now I'm going to apologise here because as I sent this photo over of the finished project, Karen, my first thought was, oh my goodness, she looks really dour. Dour is a Scottish word meaning like not amused, almost like you're not very happy with life. And I don't quite know how she ended up looking like that. There was one time where I had an exhibition and I had some paintings of girls. Actually, they were done digitally, and it was quite typical. Actually, a guy came up to me and said, "Why are none of them smiling?" And the first thought that went through my head was, I wonder if you're one of these people that go up to perfect strangers when they don't, they're just walking along their daily business and tell them to smile, which always quite irks me because I think, well, I don't have to smile if I don't want to, and just because I'm not smiling doesn't mean that I'm not happy. And I think that in portraits, quite often, if you do a smiley face, it can look quite weird and forced. And I tend to end up always making these like very dour looking girls, which I don't quite understand because I don't really feel dour while I'm painting them. They, I love painting. I'm having a nice time. I'm internally smiling, but out these kind of dour expressions come. So I just wanted to explain that to you in case you commented that she looked like she was really miserable in the painting. So back to the painting, and I'm just mixing up various different tones and going in with a smaller brush and really just honing in and focusing in on the details. And sometimes at this point I also like to do little glazes of another colour. Sometimes that is blue, sometimes it's green, and this time around I decided to put little bits of yellow tones in. This works if your paint below is dry, and because watercolour is lovely and transparent, you get those lovely luminous tones where the different colours just show through. So normally with these kinds of portraits I can spend ages and ages and ages doing lots of little patterns on top with my watercolors, and they're usually kind of leafy forms, and just for time's sake I just decided to do just a few in her hair. So I'm using a darker glaze of the same color, so it's this transparent red, and I think I mixed a little bit of a darker brown in there just to darken it up. And you can see that that is how glazing works in watercolor, where you've got a darker tone on top of a lighter tone, and it can be the same color, and it just creates this wonderful glaze on top. So if you want to do this method and you've got time, you could even spend a bit more time doing some lovely patterns in the background or in her hair like I have, and really spend a lot more time over it. I kind of rushed through this part just because I didn't want your video to be far too long. The other thing that I tend to do with my watercolor paintings is I will work into the eyes and smaller portions of the lips and the nose, but mainly the eyes with color pencil, and my color pencil of choice for this is Polychromos, but you could use Prismacolors as well, and this really helps to put a lot more detail into, for example, the iris and all the tiny little minute nuances of color around the eyes, and it really makes the eyes pop. But this can take me hours, so I didn't want to do it for this video and make it far too long, so I stuck to watercolors for this one. You can see that I'm taking a large brush and just doing a wet on wet large wash just to colour in the background, and making your background a different colour can make a huge difference to the overall look of the painting, so your main girl will look different if you've got a different colour in the background, whether that's the white of the paper or a different colour than I've done here. And I pointed there to the white gouache. This is white gouache, and I'm just using this to create a little opaque layer of white for the highlights in the face. So that is down the bridge of the nose and on the cheekbones and on the chin and the lips, and then also those little white highlights in her eyes. Now, my white gouache, because it's watered down here, because it was dried in my pan, so I've watered it down, is not really opaque. You can correct this by doing this in a few different layers, or the alternatives are you could use a white gel pen, or you could use a white acrylic ink, which I use sometimes, or some watered down white acrylic. So those are the alternatives for putting in some white highlights into your painting. And again, you could really like fiddle around with this for quite a while, looking at all the little white highlights that you've got in a portrait. So it really takes quite a bit of time, just kind of refining and fiddling and going back and forward, and seeing where you need to put a little bit more depth in with deeper shadows. And I probably didn't take it quite as far as I could have done, but for time purposes I think it was okay. And I used that neutral tint for her eyelashes as well, so they aren't black, they're this kind of dark deep blue colour. And a tiny little brush just to get in all the details. So this video is nearly over, and we're just finishing off the finishing touches now. I really hope that you enjoyed watching it, and I look forward to seeing what you do in Karen's group. If you do a watercolour portrait based on my tutorial, I would love it if you tagged me so that I could see the results, and find me on social media and give me a follow if you enjoyed my work. Thank you so much.